As we begin looking at part 2, the road to the Civil War, what we see is that the dispute over slavery erupts once again when Stephen Douglas proposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Now, Douglas had hoped kind of a couple things here with this act. He was hoping to try to encourage more people to move west and settle and kind of develop the western lands. And he also hoped that would kind of open the way for the building of a transcontinental railroad. And by doing these things, he hoped that eventually, it would bring, him more prominence and maybe lead to, being elected as president of the United States. And what he did to try to garner more support from the South was he took an idea developed by Lewis Cass, the idea of popular sovereignty. And that's the belief that the people of a territory be allowed to decide themselves the fate of slavery, whether or not it would be allowed. And he took the idea of popular sovereignty and he proposed that both Kansas and Nebraska be allowed to kind of decide for themselves whether or not to let slavery come there, hoping to kind of get more support from the southern states because technically it would kind of open up more territory, something that had been previously outlawed. It would open it up for the possibility of slavery moving there, even though most people didn't think that the climate and terrain was suitable for slavery. At least there was a chance. And with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we see that sectional quarrel becomes more irreconcilable. And you get a time period known as Bleeding Kansas, because with the idea of popular sovereignty, people stormed into Kansas to vote illegally. Citizens from Missouri crossed the border to vote and then would return home. And what you see is that two different state governments are being created. A free state with its capital at Lawrence and a pro-slavery state with its capital at Lecompton. And eventually what you have is, fighting amongst these different parties. In fact, some pro-slavery men ride into the capital of Lawrence, and they burn down a hotel and destroy the printing presses, and they even ransack and destroy several homes and stores. In all, eventually 55 people will be killed in this Bleeding Kansas era. But in retaliation for this attack on Lawrence, a man by the name of John Brown will lead a kind of counterattack on Pottawatomie Creek. And to kind of get retribution for the attack on Lawrence, him and some of his sons and close friends go down in the middle of the night to Pottawatomie Creek, and they take out 5 pro-slavery men sleeping in their homes. They take them outside and basically hack them to death in front of their families. And this kind of like a precursor to the Civil War, which is only a few short 4 years away. And John Brown will become almost a hero in the North and, kind of a villain in the South. One of the most wanted men in the South. But this isn't the last we'll hear from John Brown. But there wasn't just fighting out in Kansas either. There was actually fighting going on in the halls of Congress, something you wouldn't think would happen. But as it played out, with the debate raging on about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and all the fighting that was going on out in Kansas, one senator, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who was an ardent abolitionist, gave a 2-day speech where he spoke of the crimes against Kansas. And he spoke passionately against slavery and talked about how evil it truly was, and even called out some other congressmen by name. And so one Congressman, Preston Brooks from South Carolina, wasn't going to stand for it. And he takes his cane and in the Senate chambers kind of continues to beat Sumner into a coma, near death. It takes Sumner 3 years to actually recover from the beating that he got at the hands of Preston Brooks. Now, Brooks became an instant hero in the South, and yet the North kind of looked at him and kind of thought, that's the kind of typical Southern, way of life, kind of the aggressive, bad, kind of a negative way of dealing with things, and it just kind of showed how inflamed even the halls of Congress was becoming. And eventually, with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that kind of eventually leads to the growth of the Republican Party in the North. And the Republican Party, really kind of started off truly as a sectional party because it was dominated by Northerners' views. It was Northern Whigs, Northern Democrats, it was the Know-Nothings, it was also the Free Soilers, which was a sectional party addressing the extension of slavery. But for the Republican Party, kind of really what they wanted was free labor. They weren't abolitionists at this time. They just didn't want the spread of slavery. But we see this party develop in the 1850s, and eventually, by 1860, Lincoln will be elected as the head of the Republican Party. But before we get to that election, we have the election of 1856. And in this one, we see James Buchanan, the Democrat, John C. Fremont, the Republican, and Millard Fillmore, the Whig, kind of play it out. And as you can see, Buchanan wins rather easily, being the Democrat, and the South kind of sees this as a temporary sense of relief. After all, you wouldn't expect them to vote for those Republican views, as the Republican Party was kind of this, anti-expansion of slavery party. And therefore, the Democrats win throughout the South and in quite a few states up in the North as well. And this gives the victory to Buchanan. But tensions continued to mount shortly thereafter, when in 1857 the Supreme Court handed down its ruling in the Dred Scott decision. You see, Dred Scott had been a slave who was brought north by his master and lived in several free states and territories for a period of time. And in 1847, then, he eventually brings about a case suing for his freedom, since he had lived up north. Well, after 10 years of appeals and reversals, the Supreme Court eventually ruled that all blacks could never be citizens and therefore couldn't sue in federal court. It also said that the federal government could not outlaw slavery in territories. So it really kind of reignites this idea of where can slavery exist. Now, obviously, the South, loved this decision, and the North was at arms against it. Here Scott wasn't a citizen. He wasn't really even a person. It was kind of like property. A chair or a wagon or a gun. It couldn't be taken away from an owner, as they were kind of just seen as property and had no rights. And so again, it leads to continue, division within our nation. So as our nation was coming closer and closer to disunion, attention kind of focused on the state of Illinois in what becomes known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, as they were running for a Senate seat. Now, eventually, you have Lincoln and Douglas holding these debates in seven different locations throughout Illinois. You've got the little giant in Douglas, who was fiery and kind of fashionable and energetic, and kind of stood opposed by Abraham Lincoln, who was tall and slender and kind of more plain-spoken. And this was really kind of a hotly contested Senate race, one that was witnessed around the nation. And both men kind of resorted to, kind of mudslinging a little bit, where Douglas called Lincoln, an abolitionist, and Lincoln said that Douglas, supported the spread of slavery through, popular sovereignty, and they kind of went back and forth as they made the rounds through Illinois. But eventually, in Freeport, Lincoln asked Douglas, how to reconcile popular sovereignty, which kind of allowed the, people to decide whether or not to let slavery exist, with the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court, which had just issued that slavery could exist anywhere. It couldn't be outlawed. And in what becomes known as the Freeport Doctrine, Douglas said that no matter what the court, ruled, A territory could pass laws to keep slavery out by simply not passing laws regulating it. And eventually this kind of splits the Democratic Party, and it will cost them in the 1860 election. So this Senate race of 1858 was kind of a foreshadowing of events in 1860. Something we'll take a look at in our next episode.